Welcome to the second video tutorial on The Sun Also Rises. I've titled it Arrested Development and the Search for a Faith in the Self. The previous video tutorial walked you through the major passages and the trajectory of the novel and hit on some key themes, but this tutorial, by the end of this tutorial, you should be able to understand who the coded characters are and uncoded characters are, and review a couple passages that expose characters who are uncoded about love and characters who are coded about love, because ultimately this novel is about that. It's about relationships and how to behave well in them and to find some strength from them even after relationships have broken you down. And the secondary goal here is for you to be prepared to write a paper on the three texts so far: In Our Time, Farewell to Arms, and The Sun Also Rises. You can either link them by writing a paper about the three rivers, how they figure in those texts, or about three relationships in those texts. So let's get to it. Let's have a look at, I like this picture of Hemingway. Clearly Sun Also Rises would be a much younger Hemingway, if you will, but he was always deeply involved with another woman, had 4 marriages, and I think that Hemingway felt he was incomplete without a woman, and so this character Jake Barnes, who has been emasculated by a war injury in World War I, is in great despair about not having a woman being able to complete him. So let's continue and look at some of the coded and uncoded characters in The Sun Also Rises. Well, you can see straight away the coded characters: Pedro Romero and Jake Barnes versus Robert Cohn and Brett Ashley. And so they were coded in many ways and uncoded in many ways, but in particular about being faithful to and in love. You know, that concept in the Hemingway code is to commit yourself to love, take risks in love, and be faithful to your love, and literally be honest and pure in a relationship with another. And so Pedro is that. Jake Barnes becomes, I think, pure in his approach to love by breaking it off with Brett at the end. But Pedro falls in love with her, but is always clean in his approach to her and wants to marry her and make her, in his words, an honorable woman. Whereas Robert Cohn has a crush on Brett, likes the idea of being seen with Brett, a beautiful English socialite, but really isn't in love and can't recognize the reality that Brett will never settle down, and does not take a clean line toward love with Lady Brett Ashley. And clearly Lady Brett Ashley, who's lost a husband to dysentery in the war, and her second husband suffered from PTSD. She's had it with relationships, and she is very uncoded in her approach. Some more characters, coded, uncoded. Montoya, clearly the hotel owner, is an aficionado of bullfighting, and is one of the code principles is to value solidarity. Well, Montoya values Jake Barnes because he's such an aficionado for bullfighting, and he will only allow bullfighters who commit themselves with great passion to bullfighting and perform well in the ring to stay at his hotel. So he's clearly a coded individual. And then Count Mephipopolis, who's been wounded many times in many wars and has been in many relationships, yet he's always in love, and he's always in love with life, so he's a great role model. Bill Gordon and Mike Campbell fall into the sort of the victims of Brett's promiscuity, and they certainly think they're in love or have crushes on Brett, and it's still sort of unrealistic in their approaches to Brett, and not realizing that she really does not love them. Now, Belmonte is an uncoded figure because he fakes getting in the train of the bull. He fakes having a pure line toward the bull. He leans into the bull after the horns have passed, so he's sort of a poser and makes things look more dangerous than they are, whereas Pedro has that pure line, not only in bullfighting, but also with approach to love. And let's look at some of the, just 2 moments, and I do this with each text, with respect to a code principle: being faithful to and in love. Well, Robert Cohn is the goad, as it says here. He's the individual who represents a romantic view of love, chivalry, and courtship. His sincerity is painful. He thinks love will be a salve for him, and it's mocked by all. Everybody gets it that he's a victim of arrested development, that he's never really been destroyed emotionally and been able to love again. After that, he's just sort of a prep school boy in love. Jake Barnes also uncoded in love because he's caught between sort of traditional romantic ideas of loving, wanting to marry Brett, move to the country, even though he knows he can't satisfy her sexually. But he approaches his failure with love stoically, regretfully, and I think, for most of the novel, 90% of the novel, painfully for the reader, we want Jake to get rid of. I think he's better than Brett, and Brett only causes him pain. And it's not until the end where he says, "It's pretty to think we'd have a great relationship, that we admire Jake and his clean, pure line and breaking it off with Brett." Let's look down at Pedro on two levels here. He's coded with respect to how he bullfights and how he approaches love. And so Pedro, this is Brett Ashley's recounting of Pedro's marriage proposal. It goes like this. "He really wanted to marry me," she's talking to Jake, "so I couldn't go away from him. He wanted to make it sure I could never go away from him. After I'd gotten more womanly, of course, from growing her hair out. That's what Pedro wanted. You ought to feel set up. I do. I'm all right again. He's wiped out that damn cone. Good. The loss of the fight with Cone. I've lived with him, and I hadn't seen it was bad for him. We got along damn well, outside of your personal appearance. Oh, he'd have gotten used to that," referring to her short. She put out the cigarette. "I'm 34, I'm not going to be one of those bitches that ruins children. That meaning getting married, having children, and then getting a divorce. No, I'm not going to be that way. I feel rather good, I feel rather set up." "Good." She looked away. I thought she was looking for another cigarette. Then I saw she was crying. I could feel her crying, shaking and crying. She wouldn't look up. I put my arms around her. Let's ever talk about it. Please don't let's ever talk about it, dear Brett. I'm going back to Mike." So here's Jake in love with Brett, trying to console her and breaking up with Pedro. And here's she saying, "I'm going back with Mike." I could feel her crying as I held her close. "He's so damn nice, and he's so awful. He's my sort of thing." She would not look up. I stroked her hair, and I could feel her shaking. "I won't be one of those bitches," she said, "but oh, Jake, please, let's never talk about it." So here we never actually get Pedro proposing to Jake, Pedro proposing to Brett. We only get Lady Brett Ashley's account of it, but we get this sense that Pedro looked at her and said, "I would like you to grow your hair out and be more womanly. I'd like to make an honorable woman of you, and not just sleep with you, but marry you and settle down and have children and have a family." That's a very pure line with respect to this relationship that they're in. And when Lady Brett Ashley says no to him, Pedro's gone. There's no hanging around like Jake does and Cone does and Mike Campbell does. There's this, okay, you're not going to follow through with that, then I will not make a disrespectful woman of you. And he moves on. So we admire that purity of line, getting in the train of the bull of Brett, and proving that he's unattainable. All language about the bullfight, but proving that he's unattainable with respect to being ruined emotionally by Lady Brett Ashley. And it's connected to the moment of Pedro's bullfighting that goes as follows. The other bullfighters twisted themselves like corkscrews and leaned into the flanks of the bull after the horns had passed to give a faked look of danger, like Belmonte. Afterward, all that was fake turned bad and gave an unpleasant feeling. So think relationships here. Think the fakeness of Brett and Jake, the fakeness of Brett and Cone, the fakeness of Brett and Mike Campbell. It gives a bad, unpleasant feeling. Romero's bullfighting gave real emotion because he kept the absolute purity of line in his movements and always quietly and calmly let the horns pass him close each time. He didn't have to emphasize their closeness. So here's his description of bullfighting, but project this onto a description of Pedro's approach to being in love with Brett. He gave real emotion. He took a purity of line. He asked her to marry her. He did it quietly and calmly, and he didn't have to fake anything. He acts upon his real emotions. He is a great role model, a coded role model for Jake Barnes and for the others who never quite get it, but Jake certainly does. Let's look at another coded figure on love, Count Papopoulos, who's always in love. He says, "You see, Mr. Barnes, it's because I've lived very much that now that I can enjoy everything so well. Don't you feel, don't you find it like that? Yes, absolutely, Jake lies, right? I know, said the Count. That's the secret. You must get to know the values. Doesn't everything happen to your values, Brett asked, right? Okay, now that we've looked at some of the coded and uncoded figures with respect to being faithful to and in love, let's look at some thematic concepts in the text before we get to the paper assignments. So, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Jake has it from literally his wound from the horrible things he's seen at World War One. Brett's husband, the first one, died of dysentery. We presume he had some psychological conflicts. And then his second husband, who sleeps on the floor with a handgun because he is still suffering from recurring stress from the war. And we assume that the other soldiers are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. This, when you see something horribly shocking, you become unable to extract yourself from it. And so some of these concepts are important. Like Jake Barnes suffers from a fear of emotional consequences. He's afraid of letting himself open up emotionally. His outward sexual impotence is a symbol for his inner impotence to risk in love, like Nick Adams, who will not go fish the swamp. So those two characters, Nick and Jake, suffer from the trauma they've seen at World War I, and they suffer from opening themselves up like Krebs, refusing to engage in relationships, refusing to go anywhere emotionally. Brett loses her first husband, as it says there, in dysentery, and second is home with PTSD. So Brett becomes the male role of drink and promiscuity. She becomes the chap. She wears her hair short, and she sleeps around and avoids relationships altogether other than physical ones. So all of the expatriates in Paris have been rendered impotent emotionally. So post-traumatic stress disorder becomes a really important concept in Hemingway. Nature as a moral arena. So counter to the experiences in Paris and in Pamplona, when he goes to Berget and he fishes in the Basque Country, that nature becomes, the river, the Irati River, becomes a place where he can strengthen himself, like Pedro in the bull ring, by fishing well, by engaging with Bill Gordon well, and by appreciating their surroundings, the natural beauty, and by being able to complete a task well. So Jake needs a better code to live by than a stoic attitude toward a moral wasteland. So they go to the Irati River, which project morality into a physical arena, and his physical sensations bring a sense of order, mastery of technique, appreciation of beauty, and through all of this, there is a healing process. So it becomes really important that before they descend down into Pamplona, there's this sense of order that one can impose upon nature. If you do things well, you'll be rewarded, and you can catch fish, and they were very satisfying to catch them and kill them and eat them. He wants to take that same sort of projection of order onto reality into his life in society. Well, third concept, a man can be destroyed, not defeated, from The Old Man and the Sea. Pedro is beaten up by Cone, is physically but not spiritually defeated. Romero maintains dignity, and Cone's peripsal desire to shake hands after the fight shows you he's a case of arrested development. So two concepts here. Romero, even though he gets beat up physically by Cone, because Cone's a great fighter and Pedro's just a bullfighter, even though he's beaten up physically, and you could argue emotionally here, exposed as weak in this arena, he gets up, takes his beating, doesn't complain, avoids self-pity, the next day, or a few days after, fights well, and it strengthens him. And so he is destroyed physically, emotionally, but not defeated. His passion, his afición is still there. Now some concepts that we want to link together here. Purity of line, maximum exposure, unattainable, and the terrain of the bull. All of these are seen by Jake because he's an aficionado of bullfighting. To have a pure line is to expose yourself to the horns of the bull, that maximum exposure, to prove to the bull that you're unattainable and you get into the terrain of the bull where any sort of slight movements of his horns could gore you. And so to be an aficionado of that, the implication here is that Jake also wants to be an aficionado of Pedro's pure line with maximum exposure toward Brett to prove that he is unattainable, unable to be ruined by her. Now some concepts that are related all with water is this desire for a religious feeling. Remember that prayer that Jake had He wants to be able to live by a code, a Ten Commandments, if you will, but it's got to be his own individual code that he imposes upon himself willingly. And so when he leaves the church after that really bad false prayer, and he dips his fingers in the holy water, and then he goes up to the Irati River and he sticks his wrist in, and then he goes out swimming beyond the breakers and is fully immersed and dries in the sun on the dock, we get this deeper and deeper sort of baptism, cleansing of Jake. And coming out of that experience at San Sebastian and coming back to Brett, he looks at her and says, yeah, it's pretty to think that we'd have a great relationship. And he breaks it off. And so he's cleansing himself. He's starting to create that religious feeling by imposing his own order about being faithful to and in love upon himself. And the last two concepts, Jake learns to get strong in the broken places. He learns how to live in life in life that destroys you, and learn from that what life is about. Really important concepts. Some more stuff on the religious feeling. Jake longs for the religious feeling of the holy water, the trout stream, and the full immersion in the sea by living by a code and maintaining a self-imposed and ethical standards. The two main principles he needs to learn to live by are being faithful to and in love and avoiding self-pity. He's been pitying himself throughout the entire novel, and he's been unable to be faithful to his love and himself by cutting it off with Brett, realizing it's not going to go anywhere. He only begins to live well, and we presume love again after he breaks it off with Brett. Okay, let's have a look at the paper assignments. There are two assignments that can link 3 texts here. You can choose one or the other, and I'll just review them for you, and by the end of this you should be able to write about them, or write either one of them well. The first one, so here it is. In The Sun Also Rises, Jake proclaims, all I want to know is how to live in it and learn from that what life was about. You are to give an account of how the rivers in Big Two-Hearted River and In Our Time, how the Tagliamento River in A Farewell to Arms, remember the escape from Caporetto, and the Irati River in The Sun Also Rises figure in Nick Adams, Frederick Henry's, and Jake Barnes' ability to learn how to live in the world, run orders through chaos, and maintain a purity of line through the maximum exposure to arrive at the conclusion that a man can be destroyed but not defeated. That is, how do the rivers and each character's interactions with the rivers in the context of their current lives and the resulting sense of self assist them in their quests to live well? So this is really the question you're trying to answer. Big Two-Hearted River begins a sense of order for Nick Adams. The Irati River, the Tagliamento River provides a context in which Frederick Henry can remove himself from an immoral war, a war where he couldn't conduct himself well. And then the Irati River is a place where he can connect with Bill Gordon, complete tasks well, feel immersed and cleansed by being in the mountains and calm and quiet and appreciative of his surroundings. So here's the sort of deal of your paper here. After one character has been developed through a passage, each subsequent character analysis and other body paragraphs should receive compare and contrast analysis. So let's say you start with Nick, Big Two-Hearted River, and then you go to Frederick Henry and the Tagliamento River. You should make some comparisons and contrasts between the two river experiences and what they learned from them. You need at least one passage from each text for the standard assignment. You should look at the compare and contrast model paragraphs in the writing guide. And you have a B+ or above for the term, or you are able to maintain that. You can incorporate a minimum of you should incorporate two passages from each text and use at least 3 terms from this video tutorial. Okay. All right. 3 relationships in Hemingway. So, as opposed to writing about the rivers and their context in 3 texts, you're going to write about 3 relationships and what we learn about love. At this point in the course on Hemingway, we've read about many different relationships between men and women. Although Hemingway is famous for his accomplishments as a writer of action, his descriptions of war, fishing, hunting, bullfighting, etc., he's also famous for his candid portrayal of male-female relationships and his commentary on love. In particular, the dialogue between men and women has been heralded as very exact and honest and candid. So consider the relations between the following individuals. Mr. and Mrs. Elliot in Our Time, the couple in The Cat and Rain from In Our Time, Nick and Helen in Cross Country Snow, that's an important one since he's the main character, Frederick and Catherine in A Farewell to Arms, Jake Barnes and Brett, The Sun Also Rises, Robert Cohn and Brett, and you see Mike Campbell and Brett, Pedro Romero and Brett, and develop what you learn about love from studying these relationships in one view, that is, in one paper. So you have to have one relationship from each text, and you'll create a working definition of love. Remember, in A Farewell to Arms, to be in love, you wish to do things for the other. You wish to sacrifice for the other. You feel hollow and empty without love. And you can be together, yet independent, and alone, yet not lonely. So really, the Farewell to Arms has provided us a really strong working definition, but I want you to add to it and put some meat on it by looking at relationships that have gone well and relationships that haven't. So after, just like the other three-river paper, after one relationship has been developed, each subsequent relationship analysis should receive compare and contrast analysis. In other words, let's say you start with Helen and Nick in Our Time, and talk about he doesn't want to go back to the States, really doesn't want to be married, and then you write about Frederick and Catherine Barkley in A Farewell to Arms. You should compare and contrast their relationship with Nick and Helen's relationship, and then if you move on to, say, Pedro and Brett, you can compare and contrast that all along the way, trying to create a working definition of love. Look at the writing guide for the compare and contrast paragraph models. And if you're honors, just like the other paper, you need to have a minimum of 2 passages from each text and 3 terms from the video tutorial. And the terms you'll recall are things like aficionado, purity of line, maximum exposure, terrain of the bull, all of those things. I want you to use them and create a working definition of them as an honor student. I look forward to reading your papers, and I hope this was helpful.